Well played, SD card. You knew that I thought I had already copied the footage over from today's video, and you knew when I hit that format button, I would have to record this whole scene over again. On another note, I found a $200 camera that can shoot raw video, so, there's that. Alright, now I wouldn't go ahead and start selling all your Red cameras yet. Of course, if you're watching this, you probably don't own a Red. Point is, it's a little too good to be true. The camera I'm talking about is the Canon T4i, which is the camera I'm shooting right now, which you can pick up on eBay used for a little under $200, including a kit lens. And I think it's a really great camera for starting out doing YouTube. It's Canon, so it has great color science out of the box, and you can install custom firmware on it called Magic Lantern that opens up a whole slew of extra features and stuff you can do with your camera, one of which is raw video recording. Now, I've been using Magic Lantern for quite a while to do crop marks when I'm shooting a wider aspect ratio and just to have more control over my shutter angle and all that good stuff. But I've never really touched the raw recording feature, mainly because I think I tried it out one day when I first installed it and it just didn't work, so I just forgot about it and never really touched it again. But I've been doing a little bit of more research on it recently, and I think it might be worth taking a look at. Now, of course, there are huge drawbacks to shooting raw on such a weak camera, but I wanted to see if that raw workflow was worth the drawbacks. Now, testing new camera features, especially ones complicated as this, can be a really big hassle and probably includes tons and tons of hours of pulling out my hair trying to figure out what the heck is going on. And I could only really think of one way better to do it, and that's to do it in front of a camera. I have messed around a little bit with the settings and done some tests, but they weren't very conclusive and I want to do them again, so I figured I would go ahead and video my process. First off, let me go ahead and show you the menu system of Magic Lantern and show you what options we have for recording the raw video. Now, I don't have another DSLR, so I'm gonna have to shoot the next sequence on my phone, so you're gonna have to deal with that. Alright, so here we are behind the camera. Now, this is what the basic live view looks like when you install Magic Lantern. By the way, I'm not going to show you how to install Magic Lantern in this video. There's plenty of other good tutorials on that, so I'm going to assume that you've already installed Magic Lantern. First off, you're going to go ahead and load the special modules for recording raw, and to go into the menu system, you're going to hit the trash can. Once you're in the menu system, you're going to want to go ahead and go over to the module section, which is this little square logo over here, and here you're going to want to load the module MLV Play and MLV Record. And if you want to be able to have sound as well, you're going to want to load the MLV Sound. So to load a module, just click the set button and then shut down the camera and start it back up again. Alright, once those modules are loaded, now we can go over to the video section and we'll see a raw video option. I'm going to enable it by hitting set and hit Q to go into the raw video settings. Most of these settings are pretty self-explanatory, but the ones that I found are most useful are resolution, aspect ratio, frame skipping, and card warm-up. Those are the ones that I'm going to be talking about. The other ones I haven't really done much with. Resolution is going to be obviously the resolution of the video you're shooting in RAW, and that's going to be entirely dependent on your particular camera and SD card you're using. Before you mess with resolution, you're probably going to want to start with your aspect ratio, so 2:3:9:1, also known as 2:4:1, is what most feature films are shot at. I'm going to start with 16:9 because I feel like that's what most people are going to be using. So we're going to go into resolution, and as you can see, it's going to need 67 megabytes per second at our current frame rate to be able to record that. But our maximum recording limit here, you can see, is 35 megabytes per second. So we're going to have to lower resolution until this text turns green, meaning that it's low enough to be able to record at that level. Now, as you can see here, we're going to have to shoot at basically 480p, which is 960 wide. All these resolutions are wide, so 1080p would be 1920 wide, 720p would be 1280 wide, so on and so forth. But we can improve the resolution we're shooting at by changing our aspect ratio. Now, I shoot my YouTube videos at 2:1 aspect ratio, so I technically don't need a 16:9 aspect ratio. So let's go ahead and change that aspect ratio to what our final will be, which is 2:1, and see if we can increase our resolution anymore. Now, with that new aspect ratio, we can choose an image with the width of 12 1080, which will be the 720p equivalent resolution. I'm going to disable frame skipping just because with my current resolution and aspect ratio, I shouldn't ever have to skip frames if things are all working properly. Global draw is going to be on. That basically just gives you crop marks to show you what you'll actually be shooting. Now I also want to quickly talk about card warm-up. If you don't have a very fast SD card like I do and your limitation for recording is your SD card, not your camera, then I suggest enabling card warm-up because some cards will perform better if you do a card warm-up, which is basically just writing a big file right when you start up the camera to sort of get the card quote-unquote warmed up. But since my bottleneck is not my card, my camera, I'm gonna turn this off because I don't really need it. Now that we're back in the live view, you can see another drawback to shooting RAW with Magic Lantern, and that's that you have a bit of a crop on your sensor depending on what aspect ratio you're shooting in. But again, these are just things you're gonna have to deal with if you wanna shoot in RAW. All right, now I'm gonna go ahead and go out and shoot a couple's test shots between both RAW and Inherent 264, which is the default codec of this camera. And let's go ahead and compare the shots and talk about what the drawbacks are to shooting RAW and whether it's worth it. Well, that took a whole lot longer than expected, and it's not because it was hard, I'm just really lazy. But I went ahead and filmed a whole bunch of tests using Magic Lantern RAW and comparing it to the alternate format H.264, which is built into the Canon T4i. I have a whole lot of shots I want to show you guys, but first let's go ahead and talk about the importing process. One of the most difficult parts about shooting RAW video is actually importing the footage after it's been shot, and since I'm doing it on an unsupported T4i using Magic Lantern, it actually makes it even more difficult than it normally would be. The file format that Magic Lantern RAW records to is a .mlv file, which you will need a special application to be able to interpret. I'm using an application called, appropriately enough, MLV app, but there are several apps that do the same thing, so just Google and find one that works best for you. So first thing you're going to need to do is import the MLV file into MLV app, and then what we're going to do is export it as a DNG format, which is basically a folder full of DNG RAW photos. Now that we have this DNG format, we're going to import that into DaVinci Resolve to edit the RAW video properties. This is where we do things like highlight recovery and choosing a color space to interpret the raw footage as. Once it's been processed inside DaVinci Resolve, I then export it as a ProRes 422 HQ file to be used inside of Final Cut Pro. And finally, we can start editing. However, when I want to import a inherent H.264 file from my camera, all I do is this. Yeah. Pretty simple. So that's obviously a huge downside to shooting RAW. Most likely, if you're interested in shooting RAW, this is already a given for you, so this probably won't be a deal breaker for most. Oh, and let me very quickly mention the file sizes. A 10-second clip of H.264 codec from my T4i is around 60 megabytes. However, a clip in the same length in Magic Lantern RAW is around 400 megabytes. I remember we're shooting at a much lower resolution, almost 2/3 the resolution of what we would normally be shooting at in 1080p. Now thankfully, after it's processed, the file size does shrink down a bit, but you still need to keep in mind that the file sizes will be bigger because you still need to import them and store them somewhere, so you're going to have space to do that. Alright, now on to how the videos actually compare between the two codecs. First thing to look at is the crop factor. Because we're shooting in RAW, there is a bit of a crop factor. This will vary depending on the resolution you're shooting at and the aspect ratio, but I shot my Magic Lantern RAW footage at a 2:1 aspect ratio, and my normal 1080p footage at 16:9, but it's close enough that they are still comparable. As you can see here, this is the crop factor of shooting in Magic Lantern RAW, so as we blow that up, we can see how much of that edge of the frame we're actually losing by shooting in RAW. So you have to keep that crop factor in mind when framing your shots. Alright, now to the fun stuff. Highlight recovery. I did several different tests with highlight recovery, and the Magic Lantern RAW format absolutely blew me away. This shot you're currently looking at is shot in H.264. Notice how the windows are completely blown out. Now if we change to RAW video, you can see how much detail we can really pull out of those highlights. And that is all thanks to DaVinci Resolve's highlight recovery feature. When you import the DNG files into DaVinci Resolve, on the color page, you can go to camera information and check highlight recovery, and that will basically take where your highlights are clipping and add all the extra information it can salvage from the file and allow you to pull those highlights back into normal exposure. This does absolute wonders for dynamic range, and it really does help give it that film look. In most circumstances, I found the highlight recovery to work flawlessly, but there were a couple instances where I noticed some problems. In this shot here, you can see we have a very extreme case of our highlights being blown out by that sunlight coming through and hitting this wall, but when I try to recover the highlights from this file, it can't really do much. Some of the highlights around the edge is recovered, but as you can see, the middle part isn't recovered. And not only that, there's this really weird red dot pattern in the highlights. This would make this footage absolutely unusable, and it looked better before I tried highlight recovery. Now obviously raw video does have its limits. It can't just create imaginary pixels from nothing. It has to have some information to go on, and I think even really good raw formats would still fail in these extreme conditions. However, I don't expect them to have these crazy dot red patterns that Magic Lantern Raw has. So you can use highlight recovery to get a whole lot more dynamic range from your T4i. However, I wouldn't try pushing it to the extreme because it will fall apart. Alright, now let's talk about color profiles. Now if you're shooting with Magic Lantern on your T4i, chances are you've also installed CineStyle, which is basically a flat color profile for Canon cameras. It allows you to get much more dynamic range out of the normal codecs just by lowering the highlights and bringing up the shadows. This of course has to be converted in post to look like normal footage, but it's a pretty good way to get dynamic range out of a normal H.264 format. Magic Lantern Raw works a bit differently. It doesn't seem to actually burn on any color profile into the raw footage. I did several tests shooting in Rec. 709 and CineStyle both on Raw, and the footage looks absolutely identical. What you can change, however, is how DaVinci Resolve interprets the raw video data. Right above the highlight recovery feature inside of DaVinci Resolve, you can choose what color space you would like to interpret the footage as. At first I interpreted it as Blackmagic Design's film because I thought, oh, that will give you even more dynamic range on top of the extra dynamic range I'm already getting from highlight recovery. As you can see in these tests, when you compare the Blackmagic Design's film look compared to CineStyle, CineStyle looks a whole lot better. There's a lot more saturation and a lot more brighter, so Blackmagic Design film is a much stronger log format. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the flatter the image profile the better, because then you can get even more dynamic range. However, one thing it does not do well is handling of the green channel. As you can see in these shots, the green in CineStyle looks so much more vibrant and saturated, and the green on Blackmagic Design's film profile looks really muted and yellow. I don't think this is Blackmagic Design's fault. Obviously they put a lot of work into their color profile of film to use on their cameras. I just don't think it plays very well with Magic Lantern Raw. So instead I found I could get much better greens by interpreting the footage as Rec. 709. Then it looked much closer to the Rec. 709 equivalent of 264, and all I had to do was a very slight adjustment to get those greens looking nice and bright and saturated. Another difference I've noticed between the two color spaces is that there seems to be a really strong magenta shift in CineStyle. As you can see in this shot, the highlights and even some of the midtones are very much shifted toward magenta, whereas you just don't have that on the raw codec when you interpret Rec. 709 and Blackmagic Design film. Neither one has that weird magenta tint to it. Alright, now let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room, the resolution. We are shooting at a much lower resolution in Magic Lantern Raw. In my case, I'm having to shoot around a 720p equivalent image, which is obviously much lower than 1080p. Here I have a comparison between shot A and shot B. One of these was shot in 720p, the other one in 1080. Can you tell the difference? Shot A was Magic Lantern Raw, and shot B was H.264. I don't know about you, but I couldn't really tell that much of a difference. Now, that's not to say that 720p is just as good as 1080p. What it is to say is that the T4i's 1080p isn't really that good, to the point where you can't really tell the difference between it and 720p. So because of that, I wouldn't really tell you to worry about sharpness when it comes to shooting in RAW versus the original codec. Alright, last but not least, let's go ahead and look at color grading, which is probably one of the main reasons people are looking into shooting RAW. The idea is that RAW video contains so much more color information, you can do some extreme color grades without having the side effects, such as video artifacts, that you would in shooting H.264. Here I have two shots side by side, one shot in H.264, the other shot in RAW, and I've applied a pretty extreme color grade to these. I don't see that many artifacts on either of them, but one doesn't really look especially cleaner than the other. The only difference I can tell is when I zoom in on my hair there, you can see a bit of over sharpening and aliasing happening on the RAW video, and that probably has more to do with the way I process in DaVinci Resolve. I probably added just a little bit too much sharpening in post, which is what that looks like. So in that case, I would actually prefer the way H.264 looks in this case. So we looked at a lot of tests here, and it seems that H.264 is just as good as RAW in most cases, and it's way easier to work with, smaller file sizes. The reliability is way better. You're never going to have an H.264 file fail to write to a card, if you have a good card, of course. Whereas that is totally a possibility when you're shooting in RAW. The only thing I can think of that RAW would be better is dynamic range. That highlight recovery is so good, and it completely destroys H.264. There's so much more information you can get out of those highlights. So am I going to switch over and shoot all my stuff in RAW video? Of course not. The crop factor alone would be enough to turn me off because now I can't get those really nice wide angle shots. And I find just all the hassle processing it just isn't worth it, at least for me. However, I think if I'm ever in a situation where I really need a lot of dynamic range, maybe I'm shooting inside with sun coming through a window, or shooting during golden hour and I want that sun in the background but I don't want the sky blown out, I can see myself using RAW simply for that highlight recovery. It is so good. But for just day-to-day footage, I don't think you're really going to notice the difference between shooting RAW and H.264 on the Canon Rebel T4i. Alright guys, that will about do it. Be sure to let me know down in the comments whether you think RAW video is worth it or not. I'd also be really interested if you guys have any more experience in shooting RAW video with Magic Lantern on any other Canon cameras, and let me know if your experience was different than what you saw displayed here. Also, let me know down in the description if you have any other ideas for videos or topics I could cover in a video. I'm always looking for new ideas. I have a couple videos planned, but I think I'm going to start uploading more monthly because I think some of these projects I have, it just takes so much time and work to get into them. Plus I'm lazy. But I do have my next video planned and it is about cameras and I'm pretty excited about it. I haven't really seen this topic covered, so I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you. I'm Josiah, thanks for watching. Would you guys mind if I just did jumping jacks while I talked about camera gear? Because sometimes it's really annoying just standing in one place for a super long amount of time.